The Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Ryan K, Melissa S, Pib Extra, Matt aka Stormageddon, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Gilmer, Stephen P, and Mr. Biscuits have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, we help our retro consoles RG be the very best like no one ever was. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, I have a very special topic for you with one of my favorite guests that I have on pretty frequently, and it's always a joy having him on the show. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about high fidelity retro gaming, basically how you can take your retro game consoles and make them look beautiful and pristine, both on if you have an old CRT television or your HD TVs that you have now. More focused on the HD TV side, but we'll get to all that. Before we dive any further in, I should at least introduce my guest so he doesn't have to keep listening to me stammer on. Joining me today from the My Life in Gaming YouTube channel is Try. Try, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on, my friend. As I said at the top, always love having you on the podcast. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And we're here to talk about, getting the most out of our retro consoles, right? Like that's something that has been kind of a growing movement in the retro gaming community for the last decade or so. And a lot of people learned about it through your YouTube channel, myself included. I guess as a little bit of background for me, I don't know exactly how I found it, but I found your video on RGB 101, the RGB video and the XRGB mini frame meister. That video is a decade old now, which is just bonkers to think about.
It's bonkers to me too.
Right. And that came out, actually it's going to be 11 very soon. It came out on August 22nd, 2014. And that started me down this whole rabbit hole of watching a ton of your videos. Specifically, you have a whole series, the RGB Masterclass 100, which is kind of your not bare bones, but your basics of like a lot of it's outdated now, but at the time it was like it's the basics of getting your retro game systems to work on modern hardware, on modern televisions. And then you have your RGB 200, your RGB Masterclass 200 series, which is how to get the best possible video signals out of your retro systems. And you do a full video on a lot of old consoles, your NES, Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, PS1, GameCube, Game Boy, all this type of stuff. And once again, there have been different solutions that have come about since you made those videos, but you guys kind of really set a really good educational foundation for people to get into this stuff and kind of do it in a kind of relay all this information in a very approachable way. So that's how I kind of got interested in high fidelity gaming, high fidelity retro gaming, for lack of a better word. But I want to throw it over to you, Try, because like you are one half of My Life in Gaming. Corey is the other half, obviously. And how did you kind of start? But before we get into the specifics and just kind of talking about all this, to give a primer for my audience about like what all this is, how did you get into this?
I mean, it was really kind of a long road that I never could have seen going where it has gone, especially with I don't know if I would even really consider myself an expert in this stuff per se, but like I certainly never would have thought I would be perceived as an expert or
Hmm.
known as an expert or have people, walk up to me and recognize me at conventions and retro game stores and stuff, because they saw like these videos we've done on video quality. I never could have guessed that, as far back as when I was in, middle school, high school, playing, like Mario Paint. And I grew up with terrible TVs in the house.
Hmm.
We didn't have capabilities of anything greater than RF video, which is, really, really noisy. It's, the connector that came with the NES and the Super Nintendo, and even through the late 90s and into the early 2000s. Like that's still all I could do at home. That's
Hmm.
all I could do. When they stopped
Wow.
shipping that cable with systems, I would be routing my systems through my VCR and then ultimately outputting them to the TV with that RF connection. We did not have good TVs in the house. And but nonetheless, I would get graph paper and colored pencils, and I would put in like my favorite games, and I would get my nose right up to the screen, and I would try to, and often fail because it was just so difficult to see, to translate those pixels into, a graph so that I could like create those characters in Mario Paint and like, do my own
Yeah.
scenes and animations and stuff in Mario Paint. So I was trying to like see through the grime
Hmm.
even that far back, right? So
Yeah.
I know a lot of people are very passionate about that grime and they don't want to see the clarity that's behind it. And I understand and respect that. And I enjoy I enjoy the texture of the high fidelity RGB, and I enjoy the texture of composite, and maybe even somewhat enjoy the texture of RF. There's a character to it. I don't actively like hate composite video or anything like that. All these things are very personal choices, I would say. But it wasn't until I went to college in 2002,
And
and
sorry, real quick, listeners, with what Try's saying there between RF, coax, composite, we're going to break all that down momentarily. I just wanted to, just so that way people are wondering, what is he talking about with all this stuff? A lot of
right,
you may
right.
already know this. If you're listeners to this podcast, some of you may already be aware of this, but just in case, for those who don't, we will be breaking down all of that in a moment. But sorry, continue, Try.
Yeah, so when I went to college in 2002, I got a new computer and a new VGA monitor.
Mm,
And or I call it a VGA monitor. I mean, people can get picky about, how you use the term VGA, because VGA is actually like a specific like, resolution and other specifications and
hmm.
whatnot like that. But it was a monitor that you hook up with what you commonly call VGA cable. That's it was a CRT computer monitor, big boxy monitor as we used back then. And I thought the picture on this thing was just awesome. I thought my desktop just looked so clear. It really blew my mind at the time. And it was honestly probably not really anything special. I believe it was a ViewSonic monitor.
Okay,
And
that's taking me back. Wow.
yeah, ViewSonic, very common brand. The little parrots was
Hmm.
their icon. And yeah, I just thought the colors looked so great. And I'm like, this is the summer before I'm going to college, and it just kind of hits me because I'd been very concerned. Like, video games are so important to me, but I'm not a PC gamer, and so that means bringing my consoles. And I'm like, how am I going to fit everything I need for my computer and everything I need for my gaming in a tiny dorm room alongside, a roommate that I don't even know and don't even know like how much stuff in space he's going to want to take up. And it just hit me when I saw how good this monitor looked. Like, what if I didn't have to bring two of these big boxy things to college? These big boxy CRTs. What if I didn't have to bring a TV to college? What if I didn't?
Mm.
Um, And so I started, researching whatever that encompassed in 2002, looking around the internet. And I eventually found that I was perhaps drawn to it because it was, ViewSonic, the same brand as my monitor. They did have a scaler. I don't know if that's what I would have called it at the time, maybe like a converter or something, but it's a box. I still have it. And what it did was it has VGA input and output to pass your computer through it, but you can also switch to composite or S-video
Oh,
sources.
wow. That's really
And
cool.
yeah, and so it was a scaler, because it's the resolution of a computer monitor is not the same as a TV, so you can't just those signals won't work as is on a computer monitor. So this was effectively a scaler. It was converting those signals and scaling them up for that format of monitor. And this was the first time I was able to use S-Video, and I was just on it immediately because I knew about S-Video. I'm not sure if I had seen it before, but like I was aware of it from reading online. I was aware of it because it was like mentioned in like the Super Nintendo manual. Those
Okay.
manuals.
Okay.
Those manuals used to have like lists of accessories you could buy, and they included like video cables and stuff like that. My eye was always drawn to that because video games are like a very important experience for me. And so the idea of, pursuing the best possible experience for those just seems logical and natural to me. I didn't have the means to do it really at the time, but as soon as I upgraded to the next level, I was like immediately like, well, I have to have it, S-Video cables to go with this thing. So I bought S-Video cables for Super Nintendo, GameCube. I don't know how many I bought at the time necessarily, because I mostly only brought my GameCube and PS2 to college. But I ensured that I was able to play all these different systems with these cables. And so yeah, I kind of skipped like the high fidelity like consumer CRT TV thing at the time. And I think that's why I don't see I love scan lines, don't get me wrong. In fact, these days with such good CRT effects that are available with the latest scalers,
Mm-hmm.
I mostly do play with scan lines and stuff, but I don't see them as necessarily essential to the retro game look. And I think that's because I kind of skipped that. I went right from this absolutely terrible RF picture, or relatively terrible RF picture, straight up to getting the clarity of S-Video for the first time, but it was on a VGA monitor, so I didn't really get that scan line effect. But this was like getting me so much closer to seeing, like with Super Nintendo, like what those pixels really could look like, even though of course it was a blurrier Super Nintendo at the time, but it was still S-Video. And so I was just telling people like, oh man, S-Video, if you have an S-Video connection, like you have to buy the cables because it makes such a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, that was actually my main way of playing console games, both when I was at college and to a point when I was at home for like the first summer, because I then got an HD CRT between my sophomore and junior years. I saved up my money working as a library assistant on campus all year long to buy an HD CRT, which if I could go back then and stop myself, like I probably would have made like a better choice with what I bought. But still, I was like, it just seemed like the next logical step. LCDs weren't really in a state that I felt like they provide the colors and black levels that I wanted. So I thought, well, I gotta stick with the CRT, and I wanted to go that next level where you could get component cables. You could have a higher, more clear resolution with, some PS2 games and most GameCube games. And so, and just from there, it just kept going. And even when I started getting into streaming around 2008, I jumped through all these hoops because at the time HDMI capture cards didn't exist. Not consumer grade, certainly, and the professional ones that existed didn't play nice with video games, because video games don't even to this day with like the Switch 2, there's some weird stuff about the video output from it. Video game systems never have, and still in some ways don't always adhere to like proper video standards.
Well,
So the
yeah.
professional cards would reject them. So I had to jump through all kinds of hoops to get things down to like composite or S video to capture them
Well,
for streaming.
I think before we continue, I feel like we should really start, because you've been throwing out a lot of these terms, and I feel like we should really break down what
it's hard
these.
not to.
I know, I agree. So I think at the very least here, we should start with a primer for my listeners, and I'll start off here a little bit first. Like they're listeners, when your video game system outputs video, and I apologize for just for sake of clarity, listeners, I'm treating this as if you've never heard this before. So if you have, yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. If you haven't, there's some cool stuff I hope you'll find as interesting as I do. This is an episode all about geeking out about video fidelity. And your game systems output their video signals in different ways. Your retro systems, pretty much anything from the Wii and earlier. PS3 is different, though PS3 was capable of outputting like analog video as well. Same with your 360 and whatnot. But for the most part, after the PS3 and Xbox 360, all of your video signals are now digital, meaning they are broadcast through an HDMI cable going to your TV. That's a digital video signal. Analog video signals are anything from the Wii and earlier, your GameCube, your PS2, your PS1, your NES, your Atari 2600, all that stuff outputs an analog video. Now, what's interesting, and I don't know, there's not that much of a difference other than resolutions for digital video, right? Like you might have like a higher quality HDMI cable, and there might be like HDMI 2, but for the most part, that's just increasing the speed that the data can be delivered, right? It's not necessarily changing the video signal all that much.
Well, I mean, there's actually like a lot of kind of under the hood things, that I don't even really fully understand, because, now there's like new HDMI standards, and they have to be able to send the data, over a very similar cable, but it has to be at a higher rate. So they have to like have all of these like kind of new transmission methods. So it actually gets pretty complicated. I mean, HDMI has actually become, it used to be like everyone's like, oh, all HDMI cables are the same. You just plug it in and it works. And it's gotten to be significantly more complicated. That is a whole other podcast.
We're focusing on retro on this. And listeners, HDMI can obviously transmit not just video, but also your audio all through that one cable. Then if you go back to analog video game systems, Atari 2600 all the way up to your Wii, GameCube, PS2, Xbox, original Xbox, stuff like that. There is many different types of analog signals. For the most part, like your most common ones that we saw here in North America are RF/coaxial, RF, which was your it's a single wire. You usually saw it like it almost looks like a cable wire, like you would plug your
it's like cable
into.
TV. I mean, it is very. I mean, it derives its signal from composite and then converts it to essentially the same kind of format that is on the airwaves, but in a cable. And that's, and it was susceptible to interference. That's why RF was so noisy.
And the other most common that we had was composite. Composite is your yellow, white, and red plugs that you would stick into the back of your old CRT tube televisions. Yellow was the video signal, and then red and white were your left and right sound channels for stereo sound. Coaxial or RF would put all of that through. It was all in I would assume they split up the wires for it, but it was all in the same connector. like you said, Try, it was susceptible to to like interference. And what that means is, like, if you had something that had a lot of, like, if you had electronics nearby the wire, it would actually affect the video quality on your
Yeah,
TV, because
yeah,
there is small frequencies that are like interfering with your video signal going from your game system or VCR or DVD player, if it was one of those, to the TV. So it was a lot more that when Tri says it was more susceptible to interference, that's what he's talking about. You could literally affect the quality of the picture and the sound based off of what was happening physically near the wire.
yeah.
Um, and then composite is the most common one. Now, the reason why I find this stuff so fascinating, and I found your video series so fascinating, is that there is better picture quality for your old TV, for your old video game systems. And I'm not even talking about taking those old video game systems and making them look nice on HD TVs, which we will get to later in this episode. But I mean, just straight up on your old tube televisions, there is other video signals, for other analog video signals, that are better, cleaner, and can make your video game systems look better than you ever would have expected them to. And this is so that way I'm not taking over the whole episode. Try, this is where I would go over to you and explain kind of like what the differences are with these next couple. The next three that I have down here are S video, and this is kind of in order of like video fidelity,
Right.
the quality of it. But like RF/coaxial is the lowest you can possibly get. Has a lot of noise in it, like Tri said. Above that is composite. Still looks pretty good. It's what we're probably most of us are used to. Then you have S video, which was clearer. Component, which is what you would see. It was, what is it? It's like green, red, blue, and then your red and white cables for the sound as well, or something like
Yeah.
that. And then
Yeah.
RGB is the final one, which that's kind of its own. It's harder to explain. It's very similar to component though. But I'll throw it over to you. Try. What were you going to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, so S video is basically taking the major components of the composite signal and putting them down separate wires so that they don't, interfere with each other as much, and can be processed, separately on the TV, and that essentially, creates a much clearer image. It's the luma, which is like, you can think of it as sort of like the brightness, and then the chroma, which is like the color. And those kind of are blended together, but because the luma is kind of kept separate in the S video cable, that's why it is so much clearer.
Think of it, for those, and to break it down to even more layman's terms, think of it as like a highway, right? If you think of the video signal being like like an RF cord, think of all of your data, all your video, audio, and everything being boiled down to a single lane, right?
Yeah.
That is, you're taking all of that data and putting it down to a single lane highway, which is taking it to the television. Composite then takes out the audio from that. It keeps the video in one lane, and then it has the left part of the sound in one lane and the right part of the sound in the other. So now you've taken one lane and split it up into a 3-lane highway going to the TV. One of those
Yeah.
lanes is video. The other two are different sides of the sound channel, left side, right side. S video then branches out even further. Now you have a 4-lane highway. 2 of those lanes are video, the other 2 are sound, and then so on and so forth. Component, then you split up. Well, I guess it's 3 channels for video at that point, or
Yeah.
3
So
separate
component,
wires.
yeah, component, it's colored red, green, and blue, but that's not actually what is in the signal. The green is actually the luma, the exact same, component from S video, is the green cable. So that's just, if you plug in just the green cable into, a component capable TV, you're going to have a black and white picture. That's essentially what luma is. It's the relative brightness of everything. And then the red cable is essentially, the luma, it's an encoded red format, and it's like luma minus red, and then the blue cable is like luma minus blue, or blue minus luma. I don't know. I'm not necessarily the most I'm not going to be designing these circuits
Yes,
for
yes.
decoding this stuff, but that's the gist of it. It's encoded red, encoded blue, and then green is inferred by, what is left over. By combining all that together. And in theory, by keeping all of these elements separate, you have you have achieved what could be, if it's as long as it's a good cable, good signal, good display on the receiving end, or good upscaler, you have achieved like basically the sharpest that you could. It's very similar to RGB, which, RGB stands for red, green, blue. But again, not the same thing as component. This is like kind of the ground truth signal, where
It's
it's
the
not like,
Cadillac of analog signals.
yeah, it's not inferred green and a weird form of red and blue. Like, it just this is red. This is the voltage for red for every part of this frame. This is the voltage for blue, for green, all that. So it combines those three colors together. And this was used, worldwide for computer signals. Like I mentioned, VGA monitor. We used RGB for our computer monitors, once that became popular. And however, RGB was not really used in North America for televisions.
No.
And that was much more common in many places around the world, but especially like Europe, Australia. I actually don't really know off the top of my head what all countries might have used it, but it's kind of a fun. The normal connector they would use for it in Europe is what's called a SCART cable, and it's like a 21 pin connector, and it could be used in theory for all of these signals we've mentioned. The purpose of it is not dissimilar from HDMI, where it was meant to just be one easy cable that the consumer didn't really have to think about when they plug it into their TV. You don't need to think about, what can my TV do? What can my cable box do, or my game console, or my VHS player? What can it do? You don't need to know, because most consumers don't care, which is crazy to me. Like, I want to know, like, if I'm going to be using this display box, like, I want to get the best out of it. I want to understand how to get the best out of it. That's just where my mind is. But most consumers aren't like that. So that's why they made SCART. It's meant to be, maybe you get composite out of it if that's the best your TV can accept, or that's the best that your VCR or cable box
It's a catch-all cable that can literally do everything. It's just that it happens to be the most common cable that can handle the RGB video signal.
Yeah, you can think of it as being similar to, if you've ever looked around in the video settings on your modern, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo Switch, you can manually set certain settings, but you can also just say automatic. And, automatic doesn't always actually get you the best that your display can do, especially if you're like splitting the signal, maybe for capture or other purposes. It's not always giving you the best, but generally that's the idea behind it. It detects what your TV can do, what if you've got a robust enough cable to send those signals of a certain fidelity over it to your TV, and it's sending you the best, or trying to send you the best, without you having to know or understand anything about what these settings mean. In practice, it doesn't actually work that well, but that is the idea behind SCART. And it's like an analog form of HDMI. It's got audio, it's got all these, not just RGB, but other types of video signals that could potentially be used. And it's just you get out of it the best that your TV can display.
Yes.
So because that was used so heavily for RGB by people in the know in Europe, and how to best utilize it, that has kind of become one of the main adopted standards over here in North America and other places in the world, for people who are interested in RGB. Although I think it's been shifting a bit. People have made different types of cables. We've got BNC connectors, which is more of a professional standard. It's very similar to the like your component cables or whatever, except they've got these kind of locking mechanisms. And
Yeah, a lot of like professional TV productions, like on their professional video monitors or PVMs, they use those back there. Like I actually had a PVM for a little while. I ended up like just getting rid of it. It was a black and white PVM. I paid $5 for.
Mhm.
And I'm just like, I'm never gonna like use anything with this. I just wanted a PVM so bad I didn't care if it was black and white or not. But that's beside the point. No, so sorry, real quick, just to recap for the listeners as well, because I always like to go over all the info and then recap what we're talked about so far. What we've just discussed is like your analog the signals that are coming from retro video game consoles are generally analog signals, meaning that the way they send the way you're the way they send video and the way the TV receives video is different than what our modern HD TVs do. And basically all the different video signals we just broke down, just think of it as a way, like as each one gets better in terms of video quality, just think of it as more lanes in the highway. You can allow more data going to the TV so you can get a better picture quality. You get more information going to the TV. Your RF/coaxial cable, everything's boiled down to a single lane for lack of just for a visual example. And as you progress up through composite and S video and component and RGB video, you keep adding lanes, which allows more data. And the one we keep harping on here, RGB, is like we said, it's like, or like I said, it's like the Cadillac of video signals for your old video game systems. We'll get into it a little bit more. Not all of your old game systems are capable natively of like outputting at the best possible video quality. Like your systems also have to be designed to be able to output in different video format. It has to be able to broadcast that type of analog signal. A really good example is your NES. The NES, as far as I'm aware, can only go up to composite natively, right?
Correct. I mean, and in
Yes.
fact, if you mod it for RGB, there's this whole interpretive aspect of the colors, because the system's PPU, which is like the picture processing unit part of the system, it doesn't even like generate RGB colors. And all of our displays today are based on RGB. You can look really close at your LCD or OLED TV and see that each pixel is like red, green, and blue. It's made up of these elements that ultimately together create white and all the other colors in between. And composite, those colors were interpreted in so many different ways by the TVs of the day. And some people feel like, oh, my TV displayed this color, a little more purple, but my TV displayed this like a light blue or a different blue. And that's why, if you've used an emulator or anything else to play NES games, sometimes you like choose a color palette, or maybe your friend has chosen a different color palette and it looks different. I just experienced this past week because me and a friend were both streaming Willow for NES, and he went in a cave and I'm like, oh, your cave is red, mine is brown. Oh, my cave is blue, yours is purple. It's crazy. So composite can be kind of weird, and you again, like RGB like gets you kind of more of the ground truth of the colors, although there can be some asides that's probably too much to get into even for that. Like, for example,
Yeah, like going into like how it
the turbo
handles
graphics, like people are RGB is actually inaccurate, but that's a can of worms beyond
this is just a bare bones overview of, like, I shouldn't say bare bones, this is just an overview, because there's going to be extreme technicalities with all of this, and like already I feel like this might be technical for some people, but I think the next section to go on to also is explain how resolution works. So we've explained how your old video game systems, how they put out video to your TV, right, with all these different signals that we just talked about, all these different types of video. When it gets to the TV, what does the TV show? Most retro consoles up until the Dreamcast output at what is called 240p. Now, this for all you gamers out there, you've already heard similar terms like this. 1080p, 4K. That's all. Resolution just literally means how many pixels, for lack of a better term, can appear on screen at the same time.
Or
For
rather, how many lines?
how many
We use,
lines? Yes,
when we say 240p, 480i, those are, the P and the
that's better.
I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
are distinguishment, but it's lines. Video to this, back on CRTs, and really most display technology today is drawn from top to bottom. If you were to take a lag um, uh, measurement tool and
Mhm.
you were to take a lag reading from the top of the screen, the bottom of the screen, it's going to be different, and that's because almost all TVs generally, there are exceptions, but generally you can expect TVs to draw from top to bottom. So yeah, it's that that they resolution is measured in lines generally for that
And
reason.
just to be clear, listeners, what Tri means by lines and by drawing, think of your TV as an artist where each row of pixels is being hand painted one at a time. Now, that's not entirely correct on a technical level, but to understand it visually, imagine a painter going across an entire screen and just painting each dot one at a time, right? Each square one at a time, and then it goes down to the next line and does all that.
Yeah.
And when Tri says it literally, when it like paints it onto the screen, it's literally doing, when he says top to bottom, it literally is going top to bottom. Like if you slow it down to so slow that like
Yeah.
you would have to have like a slow-mo camera on like crazy, like to even see it. It paints it onto the screen one line at a time. And it does it'll go through, depending on how many hertz the TV can display or whatever. For every hertz, it's like what a frame per second. So 60 hertz is 60 frames per second, and a frame is when it completes that entire cycle of drawing all 240 lines or 480 lines, or as we get to HD, 1080 lines. And then 4K isn't 4,000 lines, it's like, what is it, like 2,000
20,
something, right?
2160.
2160. So that's a weirdly deceptive name, but whatever. So old CRTs did this as well, but with the different technology, which is why the video signals need to be different. Your HD TV handles drawing the image on screen differently than your old CRT. The cathode ray tube is what, as
Yeah.
it's called. And most retro consoles output at 240p, meaning there's 240 lines it has to draw. And as it gets up to the Dreamcast, you would end up seeing 480p. I was about to get lost in the weeds. There's 480p, 480i. I don't know if that's necessary just
Yeah,
yet.
I mean, I can probably say it really briefly. Like, when it's 480p or 240p or anything with P, that just means progressive, which means that each frame is a complete image. And 480i, interlaced is actually the standard for like TV broadcasts, and that's what your old VHS tapes and your old DVDs were at. Even if you could output 480p from your DVD player, or you're seeing that like upscaled through a Blu-ray player today or something like that. It's actually de-interlacing it, which is a can of worms that maybe we don't have to get into,
Yeah,
at least
no,
not this soon. But the point is, interlacing is where it is basically skipping a line.
I would say even
And
break it down even further. Progressive scan versus interlaced, it's the TV draws the image on screen differently. Instead of
right,
like you said, Tri, it skips a line. So progressive, it literally goes first line. All right, let me go down on the next line on the TV. Second line, all right, the third line, fourth line, fifth line. And interlaced, it goes first, third, fifth, and it'll do all
yeah,
those, and then it'll go back up and do 2, 4, 6. It does, the outcome is generally the same, or it's not that much of a noticeable difference to
I
most
mean, it
people.
flickers, but ultimately it's more resolution. It's a cheap way of getting more resolution that uses less bandwidth,
Oh,
for
I didn't know that part.
broadcasting purposes. Yeah, I mean, the TV doesn't have to be necessarily as robust and capable, so it's just an easier way to get that full, those full 480 lines, and that's why the standard for video is more like 29.97 frames per second, roughly 30, because each frame is these two separate fields, so it has to do these two drawing cycles to get 480i. And if you play a PS2 game, it does appear to have a lot more resolution than a Super Nintendo game or a PS1 game for that matter. Of course, now technically there are games for many systems before the Dreamcast that can, at times or even during gameplay, run in 480i, but it was not the norm. And it became the norm like PS2 onwards. So yeah, those games look like they have more resolution. I mean, I remember the first time I saw a Dreamcast, in like EB Games, like it looked like it had infinite resolution. Like it was just so much more detail than I was used to seeing on my old consoles. And I didn't understand why. And I didn't really question, like, well, why haven't we been seeing this much detail up to this point? But the important thing is, one of the most important things is that 240p is not really a proper video standard. It was kind of just game makers manipulating the nature of these analog displays, because you've got your modern TV, and if you try to tell it to do something it doesn't know how to do, it's just going to say no. But on an analog display, I mean, this is just technology that's just like converting waves into something. And if you know how to manipulate that technology, you can display potentially a different kind of image. There's such a range of specification of what you can do on this. It doesn't have to match the spec exactly. And so that's why they were able to get a progressive resolution out of these old systems. It's half the resolution. That's why there's like kind of this division of scan lines if you look really closely, especially on like a nicer CRT. And also a big part of the reason that most games could run at 60 frames per second. It's kind of funny a lot of times, like when a high profile game comes around that maybe people it's really popular, but the frame rate's bad. And, people who don't care about frame rate or don't care about how well a game runs, they'll post like one of those meme pictures. There'll be something like, two people yelling at each other on the subway, and then there's just like one person in the corner just like chilling out, like absolutely nothing is happening around them. And they'll like say something to the effect of Xbox and PS5 fanboys arguing about whatever about this new game, only running at 30 frames per second or running under 30 frames per second. And then, it's like me. Meanwhile, I grew up with the Super Nintendo. And the funny thing is most people like don't realize actually almost every Super Nintendo game is 60 frames per second. The same goes for NES and most of these older consoles. Like that 60 frames per second was the standard back then. We just didn't really think about it. We didn't think about why these games moved so fast and smoothly.
All we knew was blast processing, man.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we didn't know about 240p. We didn't know about 60 frames per second. I mean, most of us didn't. And to this day, people think like, oh, those are the old systems. They must be lower fidelity. They must have run worse than our games do today. Like it's all progressing.
Yeah.
And no, I mean, there's been some steps back as we've moved to 3D because of the processing power required. But yeah, that was basically the standard, this progressive, low resolution, progressive image on TVs that were never designed for progressive resolutions, but it works anyway.
And I think that's a really good transition try into like, why are we even like bringing this up? Like why are we talking about this now? And I think, part of it is like both you and I are very interested in this type of thing. We like to try to get the best possible video out of our old systems, but also in something you mentioned, how like some people think like, well, those older systems, they must have lower fidelity or this and that. And on a technical level, just on resolution, I should say, on a resolution level, yeah, it's a lower resolution, so it's lower fidelity. But when it's played on something that it's designed for, you don't notice. And that's the key thing. And the reason why people are even noticing now is because if you look at if you plug in your original Nintendo into an HD television, it's going to look like crap and it's going to play like crap. And I'm not even saying that as someone who, you don't even have to be like nitpicky or a connoisseur of like video fidelity shenanigans or anything like that. It's what you're essentially asking your HD TV to do is take a 240p image. Think of it this way too. If you have a 1080p television, right? 1080, and you're looking at a 240p image, that's less than a quarter of the size. That's, if that makes sense, that's less than a quarter of the size of the resolution of your TV. And your TV is having to take that and be like, okay, I have to multiply this by at least 4. And I mean, I'm ballparking. Obviously, the calculations are much more different than that your TV has to do. I have to take this image and multiply it by 4, essentially, to like expand everything out, and I have to fill in the gaps, because obviously I can't just like multiply it 4 times and have it appear 4 different times on the screen. I have to take this 1 pixel and make it approximately 4-ish times bigger, it give or take. And most HD TVs are not built to do that. Obviously, TV manufacturers could do that if they wanted to, but why would they? Like why that's not a market they're going to necessarily go after. I mean, maybe someday they will, but at least as of now, there's not like how wild would that be to be like Samsung put out like, this is your retro gaming HD TV with an upscaler built in or something
Oh,
like that, right?
people fantasize about it, but I mean, even with like open source hardware out there, like the OSSC, they could integrate that kind of technology. But of course, analog connections are basically non-existent on modern TVs as it is. It was, even 10 years ago when we were, really starting to get into the RGB side of things. There were at least like composite component S video connections on HD TVs, and that's gone now.
I mean, I just bought an HGTV and I'm pretty sure it still has it in the back, but it's still much like, it's not nearly as frequent or common anymore by a long shot. And and that also raises that also raises a good point though, Try. If your TV doesn't even have the ability to accept that video signal, like take out even having to upscale it itself and whatnot, if it doesn't have the ability to even accept that signal, that you're out of luck as well. And the reason why these old games, like I said, look like they're crap on modern TVs is because, once again, it's having to stretch that image out to fit a higher resolution. It was never meant to be seen in 1080p. It was it's a 240p image having to be stretched to fit 1080 lines, right? And that's not really feasible. On top of that, even if you don't care about how it looks visually, it's going to play worse, because it does take time for the TV to take that video signal, stretch it to where it needs to be. Even if it looks crappy, just stretching it out, that takes time. And when you hit a button on a game, you need immediate reaction, you need immediate responses. And that's where input delay comes in. You might have heard that term on other YouTube videos, but input delay meaning you hit a button and it takes a while for it takes a while for the action you want your character to do on screen. It takes a split second longer to happen on screen, which, especially in like Mario games, precision platformers, music games, like any like Rock Band or like Jammer Lammy or Pa Rappa the Rapper or DDR or anything like that, that's a killer. Like, you need, like, those games were built on the moment you press that button, it is going to react the way you want it to react. And so that is why we kind of talk about like, how do we get our old systems to play on modern TVs? If you're like us and you're listening to this podcast and you love retro video games and you want a way to do it, this is kind of a way that we're going to talk about, and this is what My Life in Gaming has done over the last decade or so, is find a way to make this type of thing approachable to the layman. And as you have said, Try, like, you're not like it's weird that people consider you an expert. I consider you an expert, so I'm not trying to sound like a passive aggressive dig at this, but like, I can understand why you're saying that. Is like, you're just figuring this out as you go, and you may
Yeah.
not know under all the technical ins and outs of it, but you have you've been able to find a way to take this complex amalgamation of technology and terms and make it more palatable to people who maybe don't have like an engineering degree in like televisions or some shit like that. You know what I
Well,
mean?
right. Well, I mean, I always like to say I'm dumbing it down to my level. Usually the best way for me to learn about a subject, especially after I started making videos for YouTube, is to make a video about it. Like, hey, I want to learn more about this. Like, the process of making the video forces me to go through all these scenarios that ultimately helps me learn about it. I'm not necessarily an expert in the subject already when I set out to make a video about something. So I think the reason that those videos, resonate so much is because we like just figured it out ourselves. So we're like able to explain it in terms that we just kind of came to understand ourselves. When we first were interested in RGB and upscalers, I mean, like I kind of mentioned earlier, I was kind of interested in upscalers, and then doing all these weird conversions to get my games to work on streaming, and with 2008 technology, and I didn't really understand the signals at that time. If you wanted to learn more about that, it was mostly like these really technical forums where people were talking about this stuff, and this was kind of secret information being passed between these people, and it wasn't really spreading further out there, even though there are people like me who, maybe I don't understand like all the technical details of like how the actual analog signal works, and how to build a circuit to decode it and stuff like that. But I still, like I said, like, video games are important to me, so it just makes sense to me that I want my experience with them to be everything it can be. So like there is an interest in just getting more out of it. And I think, we were part of those earlier efforts to kind of bring that out and a little bit more into the open, away from the tech forums. But I
Mm-hmm.
think you made a very good point about this resolution doesn't match your screen, and it's got to do all these things to get it up, get it up to that point. And I think an important thing to remember is that there is no picture without upscaling. Like, your TV is an upscaler. It's not a video game upscaler. It's not designed for it.
Yeah.
And even though, like, in a lot of ways, like, they can be better over time than maybe they were in the earlier days of HD TVs. A lot of TVs didn't accept 240p. They couldn't really make sense of it. So that's why, a lot of times people are like, well, why does my Super Nintendo not display anything? Or why do I see my PS1 when it boots up, but then when the game starts, I can't see anything? Well, that's because the PS1 boots up in 480i and then the game is 240p. So things like that, caused a lot of confusion in those days, because like video games, it's kind of crazy to think about just how common it is to play video games now, because when I was growing up, it was really weird to be super into video games, right? So
Yeah.
video games have become interfacing with video games has become much more of a priority for TVs manufacturers over the years. Of course, it's a lot different with HDMI now, but CRTs and modern TVs are fundamentally different technologies, like just completely different. And there is no just like, well, I just want the TV to display the signal as it is. Well, you can't do that because the CRT doesn't have a fixed pixel grid. It can, like I say, it can be manipulated to run 480i or 240p. In European regions, it could do even more, to interface with, they later got, TVs that could do, multiple modes and could interface with some, 60 hertz and 50 hertz stuff. So there's just that technology can be manipulated, but our TVs today, they have a fixed pixel grid. Every pixel is where it is and it doesn't move, and you just have to, analog technology isn't going to display on that without work. But the
Yes.
problem is most of the algorithms that are built into the TV are generally designed for video content. They're made to make movies, television, sports broadcast, stuff like that look, well, in some ways I'd argue that a lot of what they do is bad, but they look good to the casual eye. At least they look
Mm-hmm.
good in the storefront. They grab your attention and make you want to buy the TV. But those processes can add artifacts that don't flatter video game graphics, especially old ones, but even newer games and newer consoles to some extent. And those processes can sometimes take, multiple frames to produce the result. So that's why there is input lag. And so the idea is, with where I guess we'll be kind of moving on into video game focused scalers, which is a niche market.
Yep.
Those are designed to reconcile the very particular way the old games were designed with modern display technology, and try to kind of give us the best of both worlds, and also like kind of create maybe some new possibilities that didn't exist before, like,
Yeah.
displaying with like super sharp pixel precision if you desire, or with CRT effects if you desire.
And I think that's a really good transition. Try to like talk about what like this next part of the episode is, what are you ultimately, what you the listener want out of your retro games is, the aesthetic, like what aesthetic are you trying to go for? And there's no right or wrong answer for any of this, right? Everyone has their preferences. I really like to try to keep it closer to how it was on CRTs, with like slightly lower video fidelity, just because that's my nostalgia. But like you were saying, Try, you really love to see how crystal clear can I get my analog signals going, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's no wrong answer for that. Like there, you can do whatever you want. So I think the next segment here is, now that we've talked about the different analog video signals, how your game systems can potentially transmit the video signals from themselves to your TV, how the TVs work and how it accepts those video signals, what different types of resolutions, how your most retro consoles output at 240p, and CRTs have their own thing, and then HDTVs are 720p, 1080p, 4K, stuff like that. Now comes the question for you listeners, like, how do you want to play this? And the easiest way, obviously, if you like the easiest way, if you're trying to go, like, I shouldn't say the easiest way, if you're trying to just go pure old school, and like you just want to play it as is, you don't want to think too much about it. If you want to play on original hardware, you can find a CRT somewhere at like thrift stores might not have it, but yard sales still have them periodically. There are CRTs, like old tube TVs out there.
It's getting harder though. It's
It is
definitely
getting harder.
because people have gotten wise to them, and retro gamers have picked up the free ones, and but yeah, the deals can still be found, but it is absolutely getting harder, and not to mention that so they might need to be serviced.
Yep. So you can play them on an old TV. Honestly, the easiest way is just to totally not emulate them, and totally don't do it that way, because that's illegal. But outside of that, you play it on original hardware.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, if you really don't care about input delay or like the video quality, you can just plug them into an HGTV if it accepts that. You can also buy a really cheap converter for, I don't want to say upscaler, but converter from
It is an
Amazon.
upscaler though. I mean, essentially, when those video converters that you're just buying on Amazon, they are kind of a scam, because the truth is they're doing the same thing your TV does. Your TV has an upscaler. They're just another way to get that signal
Yeah.
there. I mean, it's not almost never doing anything better than how your TV does it, unless it's a signal type that your TV doesn't have an input for. They're still going to have that lag. They're still going to be tuned for video content, not video games.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right in a lot of ways that ultimately using the original hardware is easier than emulation. I mean, a lot of people who are so entrenched in emulation like probably thinks that sounds ridiculous, but analog technology, I mean, that's what's so beautiful about it is it does what it's told to do. There's no configuration. There's no, oh, well, it's not working because of this reason, that reason, that reason. You plug it into the inputs on the TV, you turn the TV on, and it just shows up. It just shows up. It's not overthinking, like, it's not handshaking. It's not making sure, there's no copy protection, no other weird signals trying to control this and control that and turn on your console and turn on your TV at the same time. It just does what it does. There's like literally nothing easier in a lot of ways. But
I would say
you can make it complicated as I have done.
I would say probably the like in all honesty, listeners, if you're just looking for, at least in my opinion, the easiest way to play retro games is just through emulation now. But I think if you're trying to go for the best, like a better experience without having to like go crazy, retro consoles on your CRTs, because with emulators, while emulators have gotten really good, there's a lot of phenomenal emulators out there right now. There's also hardware emulation now, which I think is something we'll touch on towards the end of the episode. But like a lot of the emulators you get on your computer are just software. It's a computer program pretending that it's a Nintendo or pretending that it's a Super Nintendo or whatever game system you download it for. And the games, the ROMs of the games feed into that, and it has to interpret the data. And it's gotten a lot better, though, but there are still systems that have a rough time with it. Sega Saturn being one of them, though. There's been some big strides with that. N64 for a while was like that. Heck, even the Genesis / Mega Drive, like depending on which model and like what time, like how, like when yours was manufactured, you can get weird things with the Genesis. But that's a whole different conversation. If you want just a quick and dirty, easy, you want to play retro games again, emulators are easy, but this episode isn't necessarily for that. This is for the people who want to take their retro consoles and find a way to play them again in some way, shape, or form, or some really high-end emulation alternatives like a Mister, which I think we should at least touch on at the end of the episode, because that's not necessarily taking your old system and upscaling it and everything. That's taking ROMs and finding a way to, that's a whole different thing. But that I just wanted to go over that here because there's no wrong way to play this. I brought up the emulation thing not to go on to a whole emulation topic, because that is an entirely, that could be a whole episode in and of itself. But if you want to play it that way, you can. This episode is focusing on the tactile, right? The tangible, like I'm going to break out the NES. I'm going to whip open that thing like it's a fucking VCR, pop my cartridge in and slam it down and hope that the pins actually work, and we'll see what goes on. Like this is a very tactile sensation that we're going for here. And you can play your old game systems in many different ways. You can play them on CRTs, like I mentioned before, or you can play them on HDTVs. And with CRTs, to focus on just that element before we get into the upscaler part, you want to look at the back of it. If you're trying to find a CRT TV, an old tube TV, I don't know why I keep having to preface it. I'm just going to keep saying CRT. You want to look at the back of it and see what inputs it accepts. Most of them are going to have your composite video. And some of them, like the one I have, has S video. There's once in a extremely blue moon, you're going to find one that accepts SCART. That's not very often. That's not very common in North America. It's probably more common over in Europe, right?
Probably very common, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah. Then once you look at those, then you kind of go back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode with the different types of analog video signals, your RF, your composite, your S video, your component, your RGB, stuff like that. that's like a bare bones thing, right? Like just straight up, like quick and dirty, get a CRT, get your retro console, plug a composite video in, you're good to go. But if you're like Try and you want to go a little bit further, you can get something called a PVM. And Try, why don't you talk a little bit about PVMs and how you hook up your retro consoles to them?
Yeah, I mean, you used to be able to get them, for 20, 40, $100 pretty easily. They're quite hard to get now, but these are TVs that were mostly used in uh, TV broadcast, video and movie production,
Hospitals.
used in hospitals a lot. Most of the ones I have are actually medical models, which are very similar to the broadcast models in a lot of ways. But they were used for so that doctors could see X-rays and stuff like that, like much more clearly, or probably not X-rays, because I guess those are actually aren't those more like actual like things that they hang up to a light? Probably more like ultrasound and stuff like that. I don't really know I'm not a doctor. I don't know what they used them for exactly, but basically things that they want to see all the detail that they can so that they can see like, what is this? Is there anything wrong with it? You can see RGB detail very clearly on these, even though it's still ultimately like a 480i resolution like your TV can do, but it's so much finer pitch. And I started working immediately after college at the TV studio of the college I graduated from. I was kind of surrounded by some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really use PVMs heavily. They did have PVMs. They were mostly broken though. But like I like saw these things. I'm like, oh, this looks cool. But I didn't know that like there were people in the know and like forums online like actually playing video games on these things. I had no idea. Like I just
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, because RGB was not common in North America, I'm preaching the good word of S video. I didn't know that like my Super Nintendo actually can output RGB. My PS1 can output RGB. I could mod my N64 to output RGB. I didn't know these things because it just wasn't accessible to us. So
Yeah.
so yeah, you can. This was a thing and still is a thing, but maybe not the first thing to look to today in terms of the PVMs, because they are expensive. But if you luck into one, they are glorious, and you can just if you get a good one that has RGB on it. Not all of them do. You mentioned you had a black and white one, so you gotta be careful about that. Don't just see a PVM and think like, oh man, this is it. Like they do
Well,
very
I was dumb. I knew it was black and white. I was like, I don't care. I need a PVM. And it's $5. I don't care. It was $5. I wasn't going
yeah,
to. It just looked nice. And yeah, like with the PVM, there are different hookups that you mentioned, like YNC or whatever it was. Is that
BNC.
BNC? Thank you. That there are converters that take SCART, like your RGB SCART SCART videos, or sorry, an RGB video signal through a SCART cable, and then convert that SCART cable RGB video signal to BNC, and that's just different connectors. Just that I don't
It's
want
the
to go too far into
same
the weeds.
same signal, different connectors.
Yeah, that's literally all it is. Um, and I think then, like, if you want to play your retro consoles on classic CRTs, whether it's the high end PVMs, which Tri said are very hard to find, or your run of the mill, like consumer grade televisions, there's a number of different ways that you can do that. Like, I personally prefer I don't like to mod my consoles. I like to keep them the way they are. But like we alluded to at the beginning of the episode, your retro consoles can only output it can only output natively the way they were designed to, right? So those higher quality standards of video signals, not every retro system is capable of doing that natively out of the box. And as Tri said, like you can do mods, you can pay someone to modify it, or if you want to learn how to, you can do it yourself. You can modify your old consoles, like literally physically modify it, like take out some hardware and replace it on the like the circuit board type of thing, and you can then it will then give that console the ability to output with a better quality video signal. a lot of your retro consoles could do the best, RGB the best possible right out the gate. Super Nintendo could do it, Sega Genesis could do it, PS2 I believe could do it as well,
PS1.
PS1. Um, but other consoles like your Nintendo 64, your NES, they could not do that. And so if you want to get a better quality video signal, a better quality analog video signal, you would have to hard mod it. Now that's up to you. Those can be expensive to do. You can find people online that are willing to do it. They are expensive. It's like like how much did it cost? I know you got your NES modded a few years ago, but how much did that cost if you don't mind me asking?
Whew, gosh. Oh, it was more than a few years ago. So man, I honestly couldn't tell you. I mean, the board, like the actual mod board itself was probably around $100. So then it depends
And
on the
then you have to
modder,
pay for labor too.
what they charge for labor. So, it can be like, $200 or something.
Yeah. So that is if you want to go that route. You don't have to. I never modded my NES, and it's something,
And I
once
have
again,
so much respect for that. I think that's awesome. I have not, I while I do have like modded Super Nintendos, I have not modded like my original childhood one. I've had the
if I
mods done
ever,
to other
yeah,
systems, which is a
if
whole
I ever
other can
modded
of
one, I
worms
would do that.
because it's a whole other can of worms because like Super Nintendo, yeah, like wait, that doesn't need an RGB mod. Well, some
There's
models
hyper
actually
specific
do,
things.
and
Yeah.
also you can improve the RGB video quality of certain systems. That's why there are RGB mods for some systems that already have RGB. Like for Sega Genesis, you can make it better, stuff like that. So yeah, it's a whole that's a whole mess. But um ultimately, you can get these signals, including the funky SCART cables. You can run them through switchers. There's switchers that people have made specifically for running RGB and other analog signals through, like the newest ones, the SVS, which is modular. You choose the inputs and outputs you want, and the other standbys are the G comp and the G SCART, which let you connect multiple to either output to a PVM or a upscaler.
Mm-hmm. And I think then, because a lot of that stuff you were just talking about is like add-ons that you can do that aren't necessary. If you want to go crazy into this, which I highly recommend you do, it's a lot of fun if you have the budget and the space for it. But the other side of though is, say you don't want a bulky, heavy CRT television. Maybe you don't want to have to worry about all the different analog video signals. Does my TV accept it? Does it, can I want to get RGB, but I can't, I don't have, like, I don't want to have to, find a PVM to be able to play that. Well, good news, there is another way you can do this, and that is by buying an upscaler. Upscaler is an aftermarket, not even after, it's a third-party device that you can, it basically takes your video signal, your game video signal, does a better job at upscaling than your TV can do, and then it outputs it to HDMI, which your HD TV can handle, and that not only does it make the game look better, it also severely decreases input delay.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you don't even really notice it. Like some games you might, but a lot of times you won't even notice the minuscule amount of input delay. Like, yes, there is a slightly more delay than you would have on like an actual tube television, but it's so minuscule you won't really notice it. And there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different upscalers that are available to you to take your old video signals, the 240p video signals, and I don't want to say stretch it out. Stretch it out, I use as a negative connotation for this episode, because when you stretch something out, if you take a picture and you stretch it, it looks muddy and grainy. That's not what this does. It essentially repaints the picture in detail for for a higher resolution, right? That's essentially
Right.
what an
Right.
upscaler does. And what I think is kind of cool, looking back at some of your videos, try back on your RGB 101, is seeing, or your RGB 100 series, is seeing almost like the evolution of what upscaling has been over the last decade. Like when you first started it, the end all be all of like your top tier upscaler was the FrameMeister.
Yep.
That was, and the FrameMeister, listeners, is just that's the name of a device. Think of it like it's not this at all, but just like you have an HDMI switcher, or you might have like something else to plug into your TV to make things a little bit easier. Your FrameMeister was a way to plug in your retro consoles. It would upscale it to HD resolution and output it through HDMI. And since then, there's been a lot of progress. You had, FrameMeister, then OSSC, then you also had, oh my gosh, there's a bunch of others that I'm blanking on.
Yeah, I mean, there's
DVDO was one.
Yeah, well, that was like kind of like pre-FrameMeister. Like this was a lot of things that were kind of designed for really more like, home cinema type setups. Some of them actually weren't too bad for games. But this company called Micom Soft in Japan put out the FrameMeister, which, was really it kind of became the king for a while because this was really designed for games. I mean, they had released a few other things previously that were really designed for games as well, but their line were, well, I shouldn't say the first things designed for games, but they certainly gained traction in kind of the the enthusiast scene, but they had their flaws. The input lag wasn't as low as what later came with devices like the OSSC and RetroTinks and things like that. But it gave us the option to use RGB through a converter component, S-video composite, and treat it in a way that was a little bit closer to the original hardware. Ultimately the purpose of all of these upscalers is to handle the image correctly and quickly, and output something that the TV has less work to do.
Yes.
In other words, the TV is just going to receive this and it's going to be like, great, 1080p, 720p, 4K, whatever. Like it has very little work to do with the signal it receives. So most likely you aren't going to be adding additional lag after you've already run it through one of these devices. So yeah, I mean, the general things have come much more after the FrameMeister. That had the backing of like a Japanese company, although I believe the actual department that made it was extremely small and seemed to never actually get funding for a FrameMeister successor despite its success. So everything that's kind of come since then has really come from the community. These are mostly just individual engineers or small teams of engineers creating these devices from home out of passion, and either selling them themselves or partnering with a manufacturer to sell them, or just completely open sourcing them and letting other people do what they want with them. But yeah, like the OSSC was a real game changer, the open source gain converter. And it's just this little box that basically what it's doing is it's just line doubling. It's taking 240p and making it 480p, or maybe it's making it 720p or 960p, which are generally signals that the TV can accept, although it can get a little funny with some TVs that don't like the weird refresh rates of video game consoles, because it doesn't tinker with that stuff. Like if the system is sending a weird signal, like some of those characteristics get passed through, which did cause incompatibility issues with the OSSC. But it was a very simple, and still is very simple, very affordable device. When I was working on the SVS video, the new switcher I was mentioning earlier, I actually used the OSSC for most of that video, and I'm honestly always amazed every time I bust out the old OSSC. Like, man, this thing still looks good. Like, it can still really look quite nice, actually. I just find it to be a very reliable device, a great tool to have in your arsenal, a great starting point in a lot of ways for your upscaling journey here, as long as you buy from a good reputable manufacturer, because Video Game Perfection is kind of the original. I'm actually not positive if they're on the Video Game Perfection website anymore, but I suspect they are. That's kind of the best and the original. There's a lot of others that kind of use some cheaper parts, which could impact the quality of the analog to digital conversion that they do. But generally it's like I don't know if the price has changed perhaps, but it's generally like a $130-ish device, and it's such a great starting point. Really, the other great starting points are kind of the cheaper, more entry level RetroTink devices. I was really
Yes.
happy that Mike Chi, who makes the RetroTink devices, he recently brought back the RetroTink Mini, which this is a little device that all it does is take S video and component video, or excuse me, S video and composite video, which, composite is the connection that came with almost all of these old consoles, at least in North America. And so you probably already have those cables. Those are probably the cables that are bundled with the system if you buy it at a retro game store or buy it on eBay. So you can get going with this little scaler that I'm not sure if the price went up, but it's like maybe $90 or $100. And listen, it is the lowest cost upscaler that I would be willing to recommend. Like, you might think, oh, I'm going to find something cheaper. Don't do it. Don't do it. Because you're going to end up buying something else is what's going to happen. There are other options like the GBS control. The GBS is that's a complicated topic itself. It's a very cheap upscaler that doesn't really have great software. And then GBS control is kind of a customized software to run it, and you can also do hardware add-ons and kind of custom. But it's very much a tinkerer's project. It's not really it can be bought. I don't. It's been a few years since I've looked into seeing like what forms of the GBS control are available. But that is a little more tinkery. The RetroTink Mini, if you just want to use it's going to look so much better than just plugging directly into your TV. It's going to output 480p, which your TV will most likely display without adding additional input lag. It may, but most TVs should do pretty well with 480p. So if you just want to dip your toe into this, that's where I recommend you start either the RetroTink Mini or the RetroTink 2X Pro. Those, all they do is they output 480p, and it's not going to be like you aren't going to be cutting your eyes on the razor sharp pixels that they're going to output, but it's going to look relatively clean. And they have some nice features as well, especially for people who maybe don't like the pixelated look. They actually have like a smoothing filter, which some people actually rather like. So I think it's incorrect to say, oh yeah, that's how old TVs displayed it. Not really, but people can like the look. But what's kind of crazy is that the RetroTink brand like kind
is
of
now
came
like it's now
premium.
like the Cadillac of it. It's the premium,
like the beyond the cat, whatever's like the next step up beyond Cadillac. Like it came to market as like the entry level. And I was like, man, this is so nice. Like, people can spend not that much money and get a really good result. And now, you've got like the $750 version that does insane 4K upscaling. In the middle, you've got the RetroTink 5X, which is more similar to the pricing of like what the FrameMeister used to be. Like, I think it's in the $300-ish range. There's also now, and to be honest, I haven't yet tested it out enough to really have a firm handle on it and have a lot to say, but there is also the Pixel FX Morph, which just recently got the analog bridge released, which lets it be a more complete device that can handle analog and digital inputs and upscaling. But the RetroTink firmware is definitely more mature and has
Mm-hmm.
more capabilities right now. And there's actually a CE model, a little bit of a lower cost model that has some features removed, but it's, oh gosh, what does the CE cost? It might be 500, 450, somewhere between 450 and 550. So it's lower cost, still very expensive, still very premium, but it's still got all those analog inputs and can do most of the things that the 400 or $750 Pro model can do. But what's so cool about finally getting to 4K resolution is the fidelity of the CRT simulation that you can do at that resolution. Because what's funny is we need 4K to really create a convincing approximation of our lowest resolution TVs because they have a texture to them. And I kind of think of it like, think of a mosaic or a cross stitch piece of art, or even something made out of yarn, or kind of one of those blankets that's got a picture on it. Like the texture is part of it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't, it's, you're not thinking like, oh man, I wish like these little gaps, where you can see the thread isn't in it on the cross stitch or on the blanket, or oh, I wish this mosaic, was all like perfect, perfectly shaped tiles, and I wish it didn't have like the gaps between the tiles. No, like that is part of creating the art, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, being able to create those little tiny, phosphor elements, um, being able to replicate that while using the original hardware. I mean, yes, like, emulator people are going to be rolling their eyes, and don't get me wrong, emulation is fantastic. It's extraordinarily important for game preservation. But people get into their camps, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people will try to tear down what you do and promote what they do, and it's like, why don't you enjoy what you enjoy and other people enjoy
Well,
what they enjoy, and
and
all
that's
hold
why I
hands
said
and be married
at the
together?
and that's why I said at the midway point, like, play how, like, the easiest way to play
Exactly.
retro games is to, like, I'm not gonna lie, it's emulation. You download an emulator, you totally get some legal ROMs of games you already own, and you play games that way. It's not going to, in my opinion, it's not my favorite way to do it, but like, you can plug in a PS4
It's
controller.
it
Most
it gets the
emulators
job
are
done.
compatible with it, and it's an easy way to do it, right? But this video, or this video, sorry, this podcast is for those who want to extract the most they can out of their old systems and find ways to play them, and so you still get that same tactile
Yeah,
feel.
yeah,
And like you were saying with RetroTank, like, it is the premium product right now in terms of like upscaling your retro game systems. Mike Chi, the guy, like you said, who owns it, just does a phenomenal job with what he does. It is like one of the best things you can. It's such an amazing product. I was lucky enough to be gifted a 5X from a friend, and it, it's been a game changer for me. And but the 5X is RetroTank 5X is pretty pricey now. Like the big premium one is the 4K one, which is $750. But the amount of stuff you get for it, like it's, I think that's why it was important that you brought up that other piece from RetroTink too, like the little $100 one that just outputs it to 480p. It's a really clean signal, and it does really well even on HD TVs. And I think that's super important because it, like, 'cause it outputs 40p on HDMI, right? If I'm remembering correctly, or
yeah,
is it
yeah,
just,
yeah,
yeah?
yeah, yeah.
So it takes a signal your TV can understand pretty with the minimal amount of effort. So like, there's solutions for what you want to do at so many different levels. You can get hey, I'm just kind of interested in this. I just want to have an easy way to play my retro systems on a modern TV. That's what it's for. It outputs it at a lower thing. It's relatively cost effective compared to everything else. But if you're really inclined, if you really want to dive deep and you really want to like see what you can do with your retro systems, you can go further with RetroTank. And like, don't get me wrong, there's other people doing something similar, but like what's beautiful about RetroTank and other devices like the 5X and the 4K one, which that's the $750 like premium version of what they have right now, is that you can plug any console into it. It accepts so many different inputs, S video, and like I have the 5X, like I said, it accepts SCART, it accepts S video, it accepts your component video, composite video, it accepts all of it. And it's great because you don't have to like switch stuff in and out. You can just swap out the consoles that you want. You know, you could have all your consoles plugged in and just swap out. Or if you get really crazy, like what you were mentioning before, if you have RGB video for all your retro consoles through a SCART video cord, you can get a SCART switcher, and that way all you have to do is hit a button and it'll just switch the video signal coming out of it.
Or not hit a button.
Or not hit a button. Yes, yes, because I forgot there's one that just detects video signals now and be like, oh, you're on your fucking TurboGrafx. All right, we're gonna switch over to the TurboGrafx SCART connector type of thing, and that's all available to you. Like that's what's so cool about what's so great about the RetroTank series,
and also what's really important, I think, as well, is just how open Mike Chi is to community feedback and community expertise. He had people in the community, including me and Corey, like using the RetroTank 4K like for up to a year. We didn't have it quite that long, but some people were using it like up to a year before it came out, and that ensured that like people were putting it through so many edge case scenarios, looking for so many different things that you could do with it. Like they would see like a feature and they'd be like, oh, could I do this? And then he might be like, oh, well, no, but I could implement that. And, so that's why the firmware is so rock solid, so mature, has so many features. And guess what? Not just for gaming, but also for movie watching. There's so many features in there that are designed to make, especially VHS, Laserdisc, DVDs, look better, deliver frames at a more even cadence, a more accurate 24 frames per second versus how 24 frames is converted to work within like a 60 hertz container. Although I should stress that the CE model lacks a lot of those features, but the Pro model, like it actually is great for people who convert home VHS movies because it has the ability to keep a more stable image through time-based correction than basically any other device in its price range. Like if you want a professional time-based corrector to like have the most stable VHS video for digitizing, those are extremely expensive devices that you would find on eBay or whatever. The RetroTank 4K, even at like $750, is actually a very affordable way to get like the best possible VHS conversion. If you're looking to preserve home movies or anything like that. So it's actually kind of broken out not just as a gaming tool, but just kind of as like a really serious high end video processor just in general.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And I want, before we move on to kind of like our final section for this episode, just a real quick recap of what we have covered so far. I'm kind of treating this a little bit like a training session, like at my job or like a class, just because it is a lot of information, and I hope we're relaying this in something that's approachable to y'all who may not have known about any of this stuff. But just as a quick recap, just to kind of go through it all again. We started off talking about all the different types of video signals your retro systems can output. Coaxial or RF, composite, S-video, component, RGB, and how each one is a step up in terms of quality, the best quality. Then we talked about how your TV accepts those signals and how, like, what resolutions they accept it at, and how your whether it's a retro TV or an HD TV, like what resolutions are acceptable and like how it all works. Then we talked about, like, well, how do you prefer to even play it? Do you want to play your games on a CRT, or do you want to play it on an HD TV? And the ins and outs of that, like the perks and benefits of each. And then finally, if you do want to play it on an HD TV, what's the easiest way? And honestly, as of this recording, it's the Retro Tank. No ifs, ands, or buts. Like that, if you want to take your retro consoles and upgrade it to or not upgrade it, but upscale it, to an HD picture quality, Retro Tank is by far like the current gold standard, platinum standard for what we're looking at right now. But there are other solutions if you so choose. There are other options, and I hope this is apparent. But just in case, just to head off any negative comments, there's no way we can talk about every option on this episode. There's hundreds. There's so many different ways that you can do this. But
and people can find on the My Life in Gaming channel
yes,
information about a lot of those, and there's more to come because I've got some work already done on a RetroTink 4K CE video, and hope to do a Pixel FX Morph video as well, because it's all part of the options available to people, and I want people to have a good idea of what they're getting into with any of these products and what the results could be like,
and make an informed consumer purchase. And that's kind of the effort with that. And the last section here is, like, there are consoles that you can get now that kind of do, instead, like what a Retro Tank and other upscalers do is that you can plug in any of your retro consoles, and then it will take that video signal and upscale it to something that your HD TV can use, like we've said a bunch. However, there are also there are individual systems, usually from the most famous being from a company called Analog, that are basically premium video game consoles that you can take your old video game cartridges, discs, whatever it may be, and this system will plug directly into your TV and natively output at an HD resolution. So, for example, Analog, they don't make it anymore, but they made an Analog, essentially an NES clone, right? Where you plug in your NES and you're plugging in an NES cartridge, it'll run it like it's an NES, but instead of outputting at 240p, it will output at 1080, 4K, whatever it may be built into. There are other cheaper options in Analog. The Retron 5 is something, or the Retron series of games is stuff like that. But I think there's something important to note. And this is how it ties into emulation again. I already mentioned before how when you download an emulator, it is a software, it is a program pretending to be a physical console, right? It's essentially taking the NES's circuit boards and be like, well, this is how it would behave, but done through like a computer program. That's what the Retron 5 does, or the Retron series is stuff done from Hyperkin. That's what they do as well. Retrons have a dubious nature from what I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, they are software emulation, and there's really, really good software emulation can ultimately get you to the same place as hardware emulation, like something from the Analog consoles or the Mister. But they're different approaches. And again, like I'm saying, like, there's people like, oh, well, don't fool with this, do this instead. It's like, listen, people, hardware emulation has done a number of things that has helped refine software emulators. So having more people working on these projects, whether it's upscalers, whether it's emulation, whether it's hardware emulation, we learn more about this hardware all the time. Preservation, emulation, these things are not done and dusted deals. We're making things more accurate, better, more efficient all the time, learning more and more about the actual behavior of these consoles and being able to replicate them more accurately. And if everyone was working just on software emulation and said, screw it, we don't need to think about upscalers, we don't need to think about hardware emulation, well, software emulation wouldn't be as good because we wouldn't have all of this extra information, these new perspectives feeding back into all of these other projects. They make each other better. So it's very good that we have all of these different approaches. But one of the nice things I think about hardware emulation is just how, even though, yes, a hardware emulator can be inaccurate, just as a software emulator can be inaccurate, but it does have this aspect of where it is performing hardware tasks in parallel. Versus like a software emulator where, generally, even if it's like a cycle accurate emulator, it's still kind of a sequential process. And the GPU, the CPU, the RAM, the doing all of the other things, like it's all happening simultaneously in a hardware emulator, just as it does in original hardware. Not necessarily exactly like original hardware, but in theory, as close as it can be. But it's got these tasks happening in parallel, which allows you to replicate kind of some surprising things, like, for example, reading the cartridge in real time, as you can do on the analog console. But also, more pertinent to this episode, video output. The analog NT, which is the NES and Famicom version, it actually outputs analog video. The characteristics of NES composite video are actually replicated with the output of the analog NT, because composite has a different character, a different look, different kind of video noise and nasties and various other things from system to system. And that's actually replicated with the output of the analog NT. So I know less about the analog output, especially composite output from like Mister. But if you have like a CRT TV with composite video, or excuse me, component video or RGB video, you can output that very easily from the Mister, because it just generates that analog signal as if it was just a normal part of the system operation. And while there are ways to get similar 240p analog results out of software emulation, I believe it tends to be a little easier to achieve sort of those kinds of things, especially getting it as close to the actual character of the composite video from like the analog NT, for instance, compared to software emulation.
Now, for the listeners who might be a little confused with what we're talking about here, software, hardware emulation, Mister, what does all this mean? Software emulation, we've already talked about. It's the stuff you download on your computer, right?
That's what computer, everyone like understands on a base level as emulation.
Yes,
hardware emulation is a different thing.
Yes, and there are some home consoles you can buy, like the Retro Duo from Retrobit, the Retron 5, I keep saying Retron 5. That's the last one I remember. I'm sure there's newer ones now.
There's various Retrons, yeah.
Retron and their various different consoles.
Polymega.
That's its own thing. Those systems, is Polymega software emulation as well?
It is, yes.
Okay.
So those are all software emulators.
What those consoles are doing is that they have a program on the console itself that's reading your cartridge, and it's basically, think of it as downloading. It's like a little mini computer, a retro, a RetroPie or whatever it is. Or I'm blanking on the actual term of it. What's the little mini computer? The Pi? Raspberry Pi. Thank you. It's kind of like that, like Raspberry Pi. Think of it like that, where it's its own little mini computer. They downloaded an emulator to it, and instead of it reading ROMs off of your hard drive, it's reading the ROM directly off of the cartridge. Those are very affordable. You can get them for like $40-$50 if that's how you want to go. That's not my preferred way to play, but they will get the job done for you. Just if you want to go that route. If you want better video quality, once again, kind of how we talked about, like when you're talking about plugging in retro consoles to CRTs, you can just, do an RF, a composite. It's easy. It gets the job done. But if you want to go further, there is more stuff you can do. And if you're trying to go like an easy way of just being able to plug in a cartridge to an HDTV, these are really easy ways you can do that. However, there are premium editions, and this is where we were talking about with analog, where they don't just do software emulation. It's not just a console with a program downloaded to it. They do hardware emulation, and what that means is that they have effectively there's a special type of core, like a CPU, for lack of a better term, inside of these systems called an FPGA. I forget what that acronym
Field
means.
Programmable Gate Array.
Field Programmable Gate Array. What companies like Analog and other people who do hardware emulation do is they get these FPGA cores and they look at the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, whatever, what have you, and they will look at how it operates on a hardware level and then mimic it using this core. That is a very nutshell way of describing it, but it's essentially saying, hey, this modern CPU, this modern computer unit, pretend you're an NES, pretend you're a Super Nintendo.
Which is, of course, similar to what software emulation is doing, but the difference here is this chip is not like, your CPU that you might put in your computer, because that just is what it is. An FPGA is a chip that you can make to be another CPU as long as it has enough programmable gates in it. It can
yes.
It can be any CPU that fits within its constraints, but not
yes.
just the CPU. That FPGA is the NES CPU. It's the NES PPU. It's
all the different parts. It's mimicking all the different parts.
All the different parts.
And what Analog does is that they create hyper-specific FPGA-based consoles, whether it's your Analog NT, your Analog Super NT. The big one right now that the NT they no longer make. I'm always baffled by that. They just stopped making it, but whatever. The big one right now is the Analog Pocket, which is an FPGA system, but you can play your handheld games on it, and they have adapters that let you play Game Gear and Neo Geo Pocket and I'm trying to even think of and Wonder Swan probably.
With really nice filters that mimic the look of the original systems, which is, of course, quite relevant to this episode. You can choose if you have the original Game Boy that kind of had the greenish screen, you can have that with like the actual like visible like dot, the grid. You can see like the division between the pixels. If you don't like that, if you prefer how the Game Boy Pocket looked, you can have it more that color. You can have it look like the Game Boy Light, which was only in Japan. You can have it look like the Game Boy Color. You play Game Gear games on it, you can have it look somewhat like that nasty screen, except it's not, you don't have to hold it a really weird angle to see what you're doing. So you can get that those effects there. But of course, you can do similar effects if you want to blow them up big on your TV, with playing those games through some means, through a RetroTink or something like that.
And that's what I love. I want an Analog Pocket so bad. I just can't afford one at the moment. But it's stuff like that. Like what Analog is doing is really cool because it's creating these premium products, but you're getting them one at a time. You would have to buy them all separate, and they're very expensive. Like it's very expensive, but you are getting something extremely well made, and it does what it says it's going to do.
The idea is this is for people who want to use the actual original cartridges.
Want to use the original cartridges and have the game system mimic the original system as closely as possible. Like software emulation is just about there too, but I don't know why this is my bias. Just to be clear, listeners, this could be an internal bias. I always feel like hardware emulation is more accurate than software, but software has gotten really good in the last it continues to. It's always getting better.
And of course, it's also very important to mention that these analog systems, they do a great job with upscaling and everything. I really like how they have them configured like out of the box. Like you're going to get a good picture even if you don't want to fiddle with the settings. Whereas
Yes.
software emulation, I don't feel that the defaults for how the games are scaled is really all that good for software emulation most of the time. However, you can fiddle with it, and especially if you're hooked up to a 4K screen, you use some GPU shaders and stuff like that, you can make it look insane. I mean, in theory, even beyond the RetroTink 4K. But again, the point of the RetroTink is that you're using it with with like real consoles, or some other something analogous to it.
Yes, the RetroTink is for your original OG hardware. Analog is for modern reinterpretations
Yeah.
of that hardware, but with original cartridges and
Yeah.
original like software, like whether it's discs or cartridges or whatnot. And the final thing I want to bring up there's two things I want to bring up, but the final thing in terms of this hardware side is we touched on it before, but a mister is kind of this like happy go between your like analog systems and your software emulation, if that makes sense. Like what a mister is that it is a piece of technology that it has an FPGA core. It's one of those cores that you can program to mimic other consoles, just like what analog does. But what's cool about misters is that it's essentially, think of it like you create a program where you can load cores onto it, and then it it will basically, you can load a specific like how can I how am I, I'm losing the thread with this. You can load a specific console, whatever console you want to emulate. You can load almost like the core layout, like how it's
Yeah.
supposed to be programmed,
You can
and the
jump
mister will
between.
switch all those gates on the core for you, and then you are now hardware emulating whatever console you want it to be. And then if people have bought add-ons where you can like still plug in the cartridges to it, but essentially it's imagine taking all the analog systems and rolling it into one single device, and you can switch back and forth between all of that.
And not just that, also arcade machines, many arcade machines, and most interesting probably to like people from Europe who loved their microcomputers. Lots of microcomputers are on there as
Mm-hmm.
well. But which and this is hardware emulation. There are I believe tools and scripts and
It's a
like
lot.
design packs to like
Yeah.
make it easier to use some of those computer games, but for the most part, like these are designed to behave like the original thing. So I actually don't have a lot of experience with the computer course, because if you don't have experience from back in the day of like using some of these weird old 80s computers, uh you're not even going nowhere where to really start with like gain anything running on them.
The
Although again, there are, I believe, I've just not gotten around to it myself. There are packs, but yeah, it's extremely flexible, and the pro here also is that it's an open source project that is like being constantly worked on, whereas the analog machines, they are commercial products, and so
yes.
there is there is a finite amount of time that they spend really like continuing to tweak them.
Mm-hmm.
So in theory, Mister has more eyeballs working on it, more eyeballs on the code, making sure it's up to snuff. Probably in general, more people just like testing it and reporting bugs and getting bugs fixed. Not to say that the analog products are buggy, but they generally work extraordinarily well. But there is like just a lot of passion and continued work that goes on Mister, which has just been a really exciting project to follow along with, and reap the benefits of all these other people's passion for recreating these game consoles in this hardware emulated format. But also, it is, kind of a little bit like, emulating on your computer, in that there's no mechanism for reading cartridges or CDs in real time on the Mister. So you do have to load it up with your theoretically personal backups of your
Yes, your legal
your
ROMs.
your game collection. But yeah, the interesting thing about Mister is it is an open source project, and people have it's kind of based around this like board called the DE10 Nano that's just like commercially sold, mostly for like learning purposes and like universities and stuff like that. But it's kind of been co-opted as like, well, the components on this board are actually like just what we need to run a bunch of video game systems. And then other companies have made Mr. Add-ons, Retro Castle, tons of other companies. I don't even keep as much track on it as I should, because I'm happy with what I've got for Mister, so I don't really need
Mhm.
to continue researching this stuff. But there's so many where you can get add-on boards if you want to be able to have more RAM. For example, you're going to need more RAM if you want to play, like N64 or something like that. Like just the core DE10 Nano won't accomplish that. Like you have to have like certain expansions, and also they make like the analog output boards, because the DE10 just has HDMI on its own. So you have got all these boards that you can kind of build and customize this stack, but it's all open source. It's all just like community people like coming up with these different ways to sell products to build this thing.
And it really seems like the Mister is like this next step in what hardware emulation's going is where it's going type of thing. It's just that right now, it's great that it's open source, but because it's so kind of like all over the place on the internet, it can be a little inscrutable. Like I don't even want to attempt trying to figure out how to put together my own Mister, because you can buy
It's
them,
not it's not as
pre-made, but
yeah.
it's a little
It,
pricey.
it's not as bad putting one together as you think. I was really scared of it for a long time, but there's really good instructions of putting it together, and actually like building your SD card is actually like extraordinarily easy. Like when Mister was first taking off, it was really complicated. That said, though, like it's not for everyone. Like if you're the kind of person that like just gives up at like the first technical hurdle, then it's not for you. The analog consoles are more for you, where you can just plug in the cartridge and it works. Playing your unmodified consoles on a CRT where you just turn it on and it works, that's more for you. But if you do, have an interest in kind of, tinkering a little bit, but it's at this point, it's really not like a tinkerer's project. It's just like a casual tinkerer's project at this point. It's pretty easy now.
Well, the last thing I want to touch on, quick try, it's not so much as anything to touch on. It's just a shout out to a friend of the show and something that does tie in with this. If everything you've heard over this episode still seems insurmountable, or actually no, let me put it this way: it's not that it's insurmountable, but maybe you don't want to go the classic hardware route. Maybe you don't want hardware emulation. Maybe you don't want to upscale retro consoles. Maybe you don't want to put your retro consoles in different video signals into CRT TVs or professional video monitors. Maybe you don't want all that, and you just want to find a way to like tinker around with emulation. This is not the episode for that. We're already going on at almost 2 hours, so we're not going to go any further into that, and I'm not as well researched with it. But I want to shout out friend of the show, Cade from the Gaming Memories podcast. Cade does a lot of amazing stuff over on his YouTube and Instagram page and everything, where he does a lot of emulation, and he tinkers with emulators, where he will do stuff where like he'll do videos like, this is how I play this game, and he'll say, for example, like Shinobi on the PS2, right? He'll say, here's the base game. Now I'm going to put on this patch with this emulator and upscale it to this resolution. Now I'm going to find this texture pack that takes the textures and turns them into HD textures. that it does that. And he's like, and now I'm going to add this filter to make the lighting look a little bit different. And he tinkers a lot with emulators and what they're able to do. It is not my cup of tea, but the stuff he does a lot of research into finding different ways to play your favorite games on emulators and making them look in ways you never would have expected them to. Now, to be clear, he's making them look not necessarily how they looked originally, but I still think he's providing an interesting perspective and interesting value to this conversation, because there's lots of cool things you can do with emulators. You can have weird texture packs and stuff like that. So go check out Cade over at the Gaming Memories podcast. He does amazing stuff, and I really wanted to shout him out because he is kind of adjacent to this conversation. Since we have touched on emulation, because they're not one in one with high fidelity, upscaling and stuff like that, but they are very like they're connected for sure.
Well, all of this, including what you just mentioned and all of these upscalers and the FPGA stuff and the original hardware mods and the different video cables and all that stuff, it's all about giving you the tools to get the look that you want, because there is a subjective element to all this. Some people want to play one way, some people want to look another way, but this just gives you the toolbox to get what you want out of your systems. And there's not necessarily, well, shouldn't even say not necessarily, there isn't one right way to represent these games. You might want to go for something that looks like really crisp pixels, which is a great way to share them in YouTube videos. Scan lines, for instance, and CRT effects don't always look so great on YouTube videos just because of how they're compressed and how they scale. But you can also, go for that look, on your, OLED TV or whatever. So it's giving you the tools that you want to get the look that you're looking for. There's a lot of ways that you can do upscaling bad. And that's, for example, treating video games like standard video content, as TV internal upscalers do, as the, $30 scaler you buy on Amazon does. That is wrong. That's not correct. But there's so many routes that you could take to end up with something really great, something really interesting, something really beautiful, something that feels nostalgic, something that feels dirty just like you remember it, or something that goes beyond what you could see when you originally played these games, something that you knew that the pixels were there, and that if you could only get through to them, you could see them. So it's all about customization, or with some of the simpler devices like the RetroTink Mini, it's just making it work, and getting something good.
And I think that's a perfect place to leave off on this episode. Do play games how you want to play. Hopefully this episode just gave you some options to explore that. And I thank you once again, Try, for coming on the show. A little bit behind the scenes, this is a very last minute recording session that Try agreed to come on literally day
no
of.
problem.
And
no problem.
I appreciate you setting aside so much time for this, a 2-hour conversation on video fidelity out of our retro video game console. So thank you, Try, for coming on the show again, my friend. Always a pleasure having you on. As per usual, though, as we end every episode, where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
I am from the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming, which I produce alongside my friend Corey Carlson. And as as this episode has alluded to, video quality related things are often one of our areas of interest, but also just general gaming tech, especially more on the retro side. Like, for instance, we're working right now on kind of a Nintendo Switch 2 video, but we're looking to address questions that you might have maybe from more of a retro gamer side or backwards compatibility. Like, it's more looking back than looking forward, even though it's for a brand new system. So we're always kind of taking those kinds of perspectives with what we look at, even if it's something a little newer or something related to modern gaming. You know, we're retro gamers at heart. So we, you know, get videos out there when we get them out there, and we stream every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern for about 3 hours or so on our YouTube channel. I'm also one of the founding members of backloggery.com, which is, if you haven't looked at it in a couple of years, it did last year get a major long-awaited overhaul. I think it is quite nice to use now. A lot of upgrades and quite a roadmap plan for future updates as well. If you want a tool for tracking your backlog, and I stream with the Backloggery crew every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern for about 4 hours on the Backloggery Twitch channel. And I don't really use social media, so that's about it.
All right. I will make sure to include links to all of that in the show notes, of course. For myself, you can follow me on social media. I am on social media at stillloadingpodcast.com, on Blue Sky, at stillloadingpod on Instagram and Twitch and Facebook. I do stream on Twitch periodically, usually on Saturday nights and whenever the heck else I can stream during the rest of the week. On Tuesday nights, I stream over with my buddy Andrew at the Experience Point, at the EXP Point on Twitch, where we do a little talk show called Talk Tuesdays, where we just talk about whatever we've experienced throughout the week. And actually, when this episode, all right, it'll have already come out. It will have already happened. But Andrew just played Chrono Trigger for the first time, and I'm going to be hearing his reactions to everything on the next Tuesday. This episode will have been out, I want to say, it would have been out on Patreon the next day. So we're doing that on the 24th of June this year. So this episode will have already been out. But if you're curious about his thoughts, you want to hear someone experience Chrono Trigger for the first time, it'll be on the VODs on his Twitch channel or on his YouTube channel at the EXP Point. I have no idea what we're going to talk about with it yet. I'm just very excited to hear his thoughts. Hopefully he enjoyed the game. Otherwise, there's going to be some words that will be said. But yeah, so that's where you can find me online. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, it would really mean the world to me. You can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. It does help more people find the show, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. If you want to support the show monetarily, there is a Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For only $1 a month, you get all the episodes earlier with better audio quality and patron voting rights, which helps guide the direction of the show. In fact, this episode will be coming out before, I think, our next patron topic, which is Final Fantasy X-2. So you can hear my thoughts on X-2 next week, but you can help guide the direction of the show and pick future games and topics for only $1 a month. For $3 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, plus patron shoutouts you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get all of that, plus 2 mini bonus episodes every single month. And for $5 a month, you get everything, all of that stuff, plus access to my monthly movie podcast, which at the time this episode comes out is Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all the guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. And in fact, Try was on an episode. I believe you were on Fast 5 with me.
That's right, Fast 5.
Yes. So Try was on the Fast 5 episode. This episode will be coming out after we've done Furious 7. So the Fate of the Furious is up next, and I'm excited for that one as well. And yeah, that is everything over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. Also, one last final shout out with that. If you do go for those higher tiers, there are 90 bonus episodes, 90 mini bonus episodes, plus all of the James Bond movies on my monthly movie podcast and the first 7 Fast and Furious movie podcasts. So there's a lot of content for you for only $5 a month. Or if you want just the mini bonus episodes, only $4 a month. Anyway, that's it. Patreon.com/stillloadingpod. That is all the time I have for you on this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all so much for listening. Try, thank you once again for joining me.
Of course. Pleasure.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.